For a good part of this week, I have been talking about the conscience, and it's a topic that became of interest to me after I became a Christian, that especially when I began to read the scriptures, I began to realize that there were a lot of things that I had done in my life before I was saved that were wrong. And I would say they were even dark and evil. And the more I understood the ways of the Lord, understand the concept of his holiness, the more dark and evil they became to me. And I really began to fall into kind of a depression, almost despairing, because I felt like I was such a wicked man. And I began to realize that my conscience was convicting me, and I needed to begin to work through those things and to ask God for forgiveness for some of those things, being willing to admit that that wasn't right, that it was a wrong thing to do, and I misbehaved, and even looking for the opportunity to share the change that Christ had made in my life. I remember the first time I returned home after I'd become a Christian. I had a buddy with me, and I went to drive around to different people's houses that I had known, and tried to connect with them and share with them about giving my life to Christ and how sorry I was for the way I behaved. And it was a cleansing thing. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to do it with everybody, and some of them weren't even interested in having that conversation, which may tell you something about the kind of person I was. But the whole point was that, I realized that the conscience is not just some kind of ephemeral thing out there that we imagine. It's something that's alive and it's active in our inside of us. And that's why we've talked about how our goal is to have a good, clear, clean, blameless conscience by not only doing what's right, but when we don't, asking for God to forgive us and clearing ourselves with people that we may have harmed. But secondly, realizing that that a guilty conscience is toxic to my life, that it really cuts deep into me, and it will begin over time to distort and to twist my personality. I also touched briefly about having a weak conscience, where we feel guilty for things we shouldn't feel guilty about. Where Paul talked about some people feel guilty about eating meat, or doing something of that nature. And we can get into these kind of mindsets where we put all these restrictions. I use my example of brushing my teeth, if you recall. But all of that to say those are kind of silly when you step back and look at them. But those things have a powerfully controlling aspect over your life. They do affect you in a very significant way. And so it's important that we realize that we only feel guilty for the things we should feel guilty and not feel guilty for the things we shouldn't. I felt guilty relaxing. I felt like I should always be busy and doing something, always active, because that's the way I was raised by my parents. And it was really hard for me to learn how to stop and slow down. I remember having a counselor talk to me one time after I'd hit a wall and kind of burn out all the cylinders. She said to me, "Why do you feel like you can't stop? Why are you working these unreasonable hours? Why do you have to make yourself available 24/7? And I realized I had just been trained that way in ministry. I'd been trained that way by my parents. It made sense to me. It felt comfortable. And at the same time, it was unsustainable. So just because it's comfortable doesn't mean it's sustainable. So it's important that we understand that, God made me with limitations, and I need to understand that if I abuse those limitations, that I will end up suffering a consequence of that. You need to watch what you eat. You need to exercise. You need to get the sleep that you need. You need to take vacations. You need to relax. You need to go up and play and have fun. You need to find ways of laughing. These are all part of the dimensions of our life, and that we need to have them, sprinkled throughout our existence, so that when it comes to doing the thing that we're purposed and created for, we can do it as effectively as possible. We think about somebody like the Apostle Paul, and we think that he worked 24/7. Keep in mind, he lived in a world where the sun went down, work pretty much was over. So the reality is that they lived in a world that had a lot of space for rest and relaxation and recovery. And so we, think about those long road trips that Paul was on. There's a lot of thinking time, alone time, good exercise, but also a time in which he could rebound from intense periods of ministry, often that led to persecution. Which brings me really to the last part about the conscience I want to talk to, and that's really having a hardened conscience, which ultimately will lead to what's called a calloused conscience. Hebrews 3:13 says that a person's conscience has been hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. And think about it this way, that when you keep on punching against something, for example, when I learned to play the guitar, when I first started playing the guitar, my fingers were killing me because you're pressing your fingers against these strings and they just cut into your fingers. And, I couldn't do it very long in the beginning because my fingers hurt so bad. But what happened after a time, my calluses began to build up, and then I could do it for hours without feeling anything because my fingertips had become hardened because I had abused them, pushing them against these strings over and over and over again. We find that when we're doing yard work, say in the spring, you haven't been out raking leaves, and you go out and start raking leaves, and suddenly you have blisters on your hands, you have sores on your hand. But if you keep on working, you'll find that eventually, over the next few weeks, those will harden into calluses and they won't hurt anymore because there's a layer of dead skin that protects the underskin. But what happens when you're talking about someone who does that because of sin? You keep on doing something that you know is right. And the hardening part is where you say, I should stop, I should rest, I should pull back from this behavior, but you insist on continuing in it. The more you do a thing, the more it becomes a habit. And it's interesting that if you do the same thing over and over again for 29 days, it'll become a habit, and you'll do it without thinking. It'll become part of your character. And so the same thing is true, that if you stop doing a thing for 29 days, it will stop being a habit, and it'll stop being a part of your character. But here's the key to stopping the habit. That's you have to replace the bad habit with a good habit. So, if you're somebody who can't stop drinking, you've been drinking for years and you can't stop drinking, what do? You have to take that time that you spent drinking and do something different. Do something like go to church, go to Bible study. That's why guys have AA meetings or Victorious Anonymous meetings and things of that nature, because they need to replace the time they spent in drinking, which was really more about having a social environment than anything else. That's just a simple way of doing it. And I found that people who watch too much TV or spend too much time on the internet, one of the keys is doing something else. I loved it. During COVID, my grandkids were on their devices almost all day long, and there was no school, there was nothing to do, and the parents were going kind of crazy. And so as soon as the things opened up again, what did they do with those kids? They put them into sports. Now the kids, they have the devices, they use them to some degree, but their lives are pretty much consumed with lacrosse and baseball and all the stuff that they're into. They're just going to youth group and this thing and that thing. And they're no longer dependent upon their devices. And simply you just replace the bad with something that's more productive, more healthy. And that's why I find that oftentimes people who come to Christ and then they stop reading their Bible, they stop going to church, they drift back into the old habits because they're like deep furrows that have been dug long ago, and it's easy to slip back into them. The way you do that is you not by going back and filling in the old furrows, because erosion from neglect will do that all on its own, but you begin to develop new ones. You start going to church, you become part of a Bible study group, you become part of a fellowship group, you start reading your Bible every day, you start listening to things that edify you and build up. You listen to Christian music, you listen to Bible studies, you listen to fabulous podcasts like this. You start replacing those bad habits with things that build in good habits. Because if you do that, then it'll keep you from developing calluses. Because once you develop a callus, well, Paul said in Ephesians 4:19, he says, having become callous, they've given themselves up to indecent behavior for the practice of every kind of impurity and greediness. In other words, they do bad things and they don't feel bad anymore. In fact, they do bad things and they feel good when they do bad things, because now their mind has been so corrupted, their conscience has been so deadened, that they think that good is evil and evil is good. Isaiah 5:20, that's what the Lord told Israel. You've come to the place where you look at evil things, you call them good. You take things that are bitter and you say they're sweet. You do things that are wrong and you embrace them and declare that they're good. We see that happening in our culture, but before it ever happened to culture, it started happening with individuals. Individuals who are in high places, people or powerful people, but even ordinary people. And that's really where we have to understand we have a responsibility to live with a clear conscience before God and not to allow our conscience to be hardened by insisting on doing something that we know isn't right and not becoming calloused to the point where we can't stop doing what we've done. Once you become calloused, you're entering into that area called reprobate, and that's a pretty damnable place to end up in. Well, I pray that God has used all these conversations this week to speak into your life in a positive way. We'll pick it up next week as we'll move on into the next passage, or at least the rest of this passage. Thank you for joining with me. God bless you and go in His grace.